applause at the beginning. That's always a convenient way to start. I was actually going to start by saying, you'll find out in a minute, this is not just pandering to the audience, but I love Iowa. I was raised in Iowa, so in extreme northeast Iowa. I was raised in El McKee, Winnebago counties, and my mother's family has been in Clayton County for many, many, many generations. So Sarah and I were just talking, like, people can keep the coast. That's fabulous. Stay there. I like our very easy to live and low density of population in the Midwest. I think it's terrific. So thank you so much for having me, and it's really great to have the opportunity to talk to you about what Illinois is doing in terms of research data right now. So I'm the director of our research data service. This has been formally established for about a year and a half. I've been there for about that long. So I can tell you quite a bit about what has been going on and the experiences that we've had so far. So just starting off, our program is really a collaboration between multiple units on campus. And you'll see as we go through the talk that it really does have to be that way, because researchers will really come at it in a lot of different directions. And they don't expect, or they don't think in a compartmentalized way where, okay, I'll ask the library this question, I'll ask IT this question, I'll ask this person this question. It's the whole thing to them. And so you'll sit down in a meeting and they'll ask you all of these questions at once. So it's a really an opportunity to interact with a lot of other units on campus. So for us, we do have our home base in the university library, but we also work very closely with our graduate school for library and information science, also with our provost for, sorry for the little glitch there, but this is for our Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research. We have quarterly meetings with them. Peter Schiffer is our Vice Chancellor for Research, and he's very interested in how the research data service is progressing and can serve our campus. We also absolutely interact with our campus IT and also with our supercomputing center. So the purpose of our research data service is to provide the Illinois campus with the ability to steward and manage the research data. I always clarify this isn't about analyzing or visualizing or any of those really fun things that people love to do with their data. It's really about actually just managing it, which is the thing that kind of gets pushed off to the side. I call it benign neglect or deferred maintenance or any of those kinds of words that you learn and usually use for other things, but the same thing happens with data as well. So we're doing this through having the appropriate expertise, so as well as tools and infrastructures to help researchers do this. Feel free at any time to interrupt and ask me questions or ask me to slow down. I can ramp up a little bit sometimes, so I'm aware that my speaking habits aren't always amenable to everybody, so feel free at any time. So just to give you an idea of how this progressed on our campus. So in 2011, Sarah Shreves, Beth Namachabaya, who were both at the library, and then Howard Gunther, who is part of our Office for Research, participated in the eScience Institute. So they did this campus-wide scan to look at where our weaknesses were, and they immediately found that data stewardship was one of the weaknesses that our campus had. So they then formed basically a year of data stewardship, where they had a year-long events and seminars and symposiums really talking about what it meant to have data stewardship on campus. And that basically culminated with realizing that we really needed a service to help people manage their data. And so that's really where the RDS was born out of that. So a proposal for campus-wide funding was put into our Office of Vice Chancellor of Research. Of course, there was the requisite reduction in funding and negotiation of what that was really going to mean. But ultimately, in 2013, it became part of our campus-wide strategic plan. And at Illinois, that's a really important thing. So once you're part of the strategic plan, then it's part of the campus's mission, and it's really emphasizes that there's some oomph behind it, I like to say. So then hiring was initiated in late 2013, and we just completed hiring then for our group in the spring of this year. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. So this entire time, this was all things that were happening campus-wide. So all of the units that I mentioned on the first slide were involved in this. It was very much a global operation across the campus. But while this was going on, the library internally had been doing a lot of movement along the data continuum. So they actually started a data services program, I think in 2009, and that program is actually dedicated to really having people use data, so GIS data, census data, having the appropriate statistical software and such things, and their scholarly commons. So our campus and our library had already been interested in data for several years at that point. So while the year of data stewardship was going on, they initiated an internal e-research task force, basically to look at, well, what kinds of things could our library do now without any committed funding? And one thing they did realize right away is they could do data management outreach. And that's actually how I was introduced to the library's role in Institute. I was the executive director of a very large grant, and someone came and talked to us about data sharing plans, which we had, and I wasn't quite sure exactly what it was going to mean for what our data was for that grant, what we were going to have to do with it, and that's how I was introduced to the library's role in data. So then once it became clear that the RDS was going to happen, they formed an e-research implementation committee, and this committee did a bunch of wonderful things that I'll mention in another slide to basically keep the momentum going when there's always the requisite lag between when something says it's going to be funded and when you actually get people on the ground and doing and getting that running. So, for example, that group did several things. So we do use DMP tool on our campus, and we did do customizations so that for each one of the different agencies, we have help text that's specific to Illinois, including links and other link outs and suggested text that works specifically for us. They also started beginning doing the workshops, and they established a research data service interest group, so there could be greater library-wide interest in the program. And they also piloted minting DOIs through DataSite with ECID, so that's the producers in there. If you're interested in reading, sorry, did you have a question?
Finish your sentence.
Oh, sorry. I said if you're interested in reading more about the report, it is in our institutional repositories. You can go to go.illinois.edu e-research_services.
I don't know what DMP tool is.
Oh, sure. Okay. So DMP tool is basically an online wizard that lets people walk through DMPs. So a data management plan is something that's required by grant agencies. Specifically, NSF has been requiring them since 2011. And actually, as of October, it hasn't been implemented yet, but basically another 8 agencies have said this year they'll start requiring them for all grants. And I think another 2 more agencies will start requiring them in January. There might be a lag in that because, you know, the agencies aren't always as on time as meant, but certainly all grants basically at some point are going to require a data management plan. So unfortunately, and I'll talk actually a little bit more about this tomorrow if you are able to come, but none of the agencies really do it the same way with the same language, and actually different directorates or different institutes within agencies also have different requirements. So that's why there's actually a whole wizard actually for helping people navigate through that. It's actually at dmptool.org. It's pretty helpful. It's nothing's ever perfect. We're always wishing it would be a little bit more easy and streamlined, but at least it's all in one spot, which is useful for people. I think it's especially useful for I think Office of Sponsored Projects people because it does have like everything all in one spot, especially when you're working with a lot of different grants all at once. You know, some researchers maybe they only ever apply to NIH, so for them it's not quite as a problem. But for people who are working with grants all across agencies, it's a really good resource for that. Sure, yeah, feel free at any time to ask questions. So early progress for the RDS then is that we did hire our staff. So there's 4 of us who are entirely committed to research data services at the University of Illinois. So there's me as the director, we have 2 full-time data curators, and we have a full-time data repository developer. And then we've had other people who, you'll see as we go, other people who have been involved at various stages or with various levels of commitment. But there is 4 people that we've dedicated to it. We've honed our workshops, we've scoped data repositories, and we've garnered some champions. So our first year annual report, nothing fancy, there was no great graphic design involved, it's me in Word, so don't be looking for anything really fancy looking. But it does say what we've done for the first year, and that's at go.illinois.edu/RDS_ideals. So ideals is our institutional repository, so feel free to check that out. Okay, so what have our challenges been? I usually like to talk about this in terms of universities being diverse by design. We do this on purpose. We do this to ourselves. We go out and we look for the most unique snowflake faculty that we can find. We only want people who are doing something really unique that nobody else in the world is doing, and that means they have really unique needs and challenges. So I see some people smiling, as in you understand but this is what we do. That's how they get tenure, right? In the end, you know, are you the only person in the world who can do this? Terrific, we'll stay here forever in your isolation. So one way that I was trying to look at this to try and convey, or even for myself, think about how diverse really is this, is we have a campus news bureau that always puts up stories about great research that's happened on our campus. And so one month I looked at all the stories that came out, and there were 6 different stories, and they had been published in these journals. So the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, Psychological Science, the Journal of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, 2 in Nature, and 1 in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. So that's pretty unique right there. instead I'm just gonna highlight one from each line. So gut microbiota, stars, distracted driving, outbreak response, bullying, and mechanisms. So that not only conveys how incredibly diverse it is, but how granular it is. Like these are really specific things, right? Just kind of highlighting how diverse our work is. So otherwise, we can also just look at the numbers. 17 colleges, over 150 different programs of study. 30,000 undergraduates, over 10,000 graduate students, nearly 3,000 faculty. We have several hundred thousands of dollars of R&D that comes into campus every year. I always get nervous when I show this number to a library because you know how much slop is in this number, but that's why there's an approximation sign, and I rounded it, but around 6,500 articles come out of our campus every year. So even though that's not an exact number, it's not 65 and it's not 650, it's thousands, right? It's many thousands of outputs come out of our campus. So the output is just incredible then, what comes out of our campus. So that's really a lot. Okay, so how are we trying to be a research data service then with this kind of breadth and depth? Well, you try and look at basically the lowest common denominator and what can you help people, on a uniform basis across all things. And we know that there are a lot of needs that there's good pockets of, but they don't quite meet that level or that threshold where it's a good direction for us to go in. For example, there's a lot of people on campus who could really use database design. Like they have a lot of data, but it's just not quite enough that it really warrants us having like a dedicated unit or a dedicated thrust for us, which is unfortunate in some ways, but it's also just our reality right now. So we'll see what our future holds, but as of right now, this is what we can do. So what we do is data management consultation with people, and this isn't talking with them about their research or their science at all. It's really just kind of project management in a lot of ways. But we talk through the data management planning process, and just things like, so how much data will you be having? You ask them to you do a little bit of mental math. So okay, so you're gonna have a 100 megabyte file, and you're gonna generate one of those every day times this many days or this many years. Yeah, you're gonna run out of space really fast. So okay, let's plan for that now. Or just things like that. That honestly, the faculty just don't really have time all the time to be thinking like that far ahead. So for that regard, the data management planning process is good. We talk about what data can or cannot be made accessible. There is completely and utterly valid reasons for data not to be made accessible. So certainly sensitive data because of human subjects, or straight up IP reasons, like it's third-party data, like you can't make it available. Help determine what data can be reasonably preserved. I'll show you an example of this in a couple slides, but some of it really just, it's not reasonable, or the amount of money or cost that it would take to preserve some of the data isn't really, at this point, going to outweigh the cost. The benefit won't outweigh the cost. Identify what resources are available on campus. I assume all campuses are like this, but certainly in Illinois, we're very distributed. It's really hard to get anybody's attention. Somebody once called email the kudzu of academia, so they don't read email, nobody reads anything. So even having people know what is available on our campus is a challenge. And also identifying what resources are available elsewhere. So we look at part of our job is knowing, okay, well, what's happening in the data world, and is there a new repository springing up in MRI data, and would that be a good home for some of this data? Just helping people look anywhere. We don't care where it is, just as long as they get the right help. So we do data management workshops. So we've kind of bounced around a little bit on what the format and the number of these workshops would be, but we do have an introduction to data management. We also have one specifically on data and process documentation and organization. And then finally we have one on data publishing. So those have been pretty successful. We've been holding them twice a semester, and we do hold them at the main library, but we always emphasize that we're willing to travel. And we do quite a bit. So we've done kind of one-off workshops then for organic chemistry or bioanthropology. And those are actually really nice because then you have the opportunity to target your content to those specific audiences. And those also have been really great ways to partner with subject librarians who know their department really well, who know the kind of research that's going on, so you can make sure that people are getting the content that's going to be most relevant to them. And then finally, for data publication in Illinois, there are kind of two different things going on. So Ideals is our institutional repository, and we have definitely used it for data, and we continue to use it for data. But it can only hold fairly small files. They do have to be static, and pretty much flat. So anything that's super structured, it just is not well represented in Ideals at all. But I mean, we can do it, and we have, and I'll show some examples, especially tomorrow, where it's been really useful. It's It's also intended for long-term preservation. That's people's expectation on campus, is that we're keeping this forever. Data's gonna be a little bit different in terms of, we're actually only committing to at least 5 years, but we reserve the right to do basically a preservation appraisal and to see if we can store it really long-term. That appraisal is gonna do a couple different things. One is it means, oh, we've looked and there's, it's a CSV file, it's little, it's not taking up any room, everything's fine, just leave it there. It might be like, oh, for some reason somebody gave us, I don't know, 300 gigabytes of something, and it's in a format we can't even open anymore, and nobody's ever looked at it. So, we should have the right to decide whether or not we can bump that off. It also gives us the opportunity though to look at, well, this is something that, same thing, right? Okay, it's really big, it's in a funky format, but it has been accessed 10,000 times. That must be pretty valuable then. So in that case, you bump up preservation. We go, this is valuable, we better figure out how to preserve it because clearly people have been using it and it's important. Logistically, we don't know how we're going to do that yet, but I definitely think that's our goal. Like that's, as opposed to FigShare or some other like blanket, Medley actually just started a data service, as opposed to those kinds of things where they're like, sure, we'll store it forever. Like storing isn't really gonna be necessarily our problem. It's gonna be the actual preservation of things that are really important to make our problem in the long run. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit tomorrow again too. So I think a lot of the reason why you probably wanted me to come here is just to talk about what the experience has been in the program so far. So I have a ton of quotes actually, because I thought, well, who cares what I think? Why don't you just hear what I've actually come into? So we have had a lot of user-presented challenges. So I'll just kind of go through some of these. So this is one of my favorite emails ever. The subject of the email was cost of archiving petabyte scale data. So this was somebody who's writing a data management plan and wanted to know how much should they budget to archive 2 to 4 petabytes of data if the grant expires in 2020. Okay, they would never get the grant if we actually try to put a number on that. So instead you give them language about, if the grant expires, we'll either request a supplement from the agency to cover the cost for additional years, or we'll work with our library to figure out if there's a subset of the data, or we'll figure out something basically. We're working with our library. We found this in a grant application, which was RDS may also provide some more general database components such as authentication and access service controls. We don't do that. So we can try and help them. Somebody who does, like that's fine, but that's not what we do. We'll talk about other things in a minute. I was also wondering if there's any university-wide practice regarding data sharing. So people wondering, like, well, what am I really supposed to do? There's questions around that. Chris just came by and said you were the one to talk to about getting larger group folders on Box. So I'm a person who knows the person to help you do that, so I can do that. That's fine. But things like Chris said you can do this. Oh okay. Who's Chris? What steps should I take to de-identify the individual raw data to prepare them for publication? So some pretty tricky questions there, right? Right now we are using a shared web page to upload and download information from different groups. I'd like to see what ideas you folks have about what can be done. So those aren't easy questions necessarily, right? So challenging, but good. I don't necessarily want you trying to manage this either yourself. We can add some more examples of what there. He indicated that it amounted to about 3 file cabinet drawers worth of material. If you put up a research data service, people are going to come at you with their data. And it's not always going to be nice little CSV files that you can stick in a repository. It's going to be filing cabinets full of papers and things like that. So preparing yourself for these kinds of questions as well. We basically just say legacy data is out of scope for us. That's just kind of a bound that we've really had to put in there. We have ideas about ways that we can maybe do some culling or actually kind of an application process. Because if there is really fabulous data sets out there and they do happen to be in a paper format or they're on Bax tapes or they're whatever, but they're valuable to the community, trying to work through a way that we could rescue it is a valuable thing, but it's time consuming and expensive, so we have to bound it. I'm not sure who the appropriate person or unit is to contact, so I thought I would just start with you. And finally, this is almost perfect timing as we're having these very discussions right now within our unit and we're trying to figure out ways to get people to access our data. So I went through these because I wanted to just kind of present. You'll see that it's a variety of cross-unit needs there. So in some cases it's like, well, let's talk to the IRB. Okay, let's talk to your IT person. Okay, let's talk to this or this person. Or maybe it is us that knows the right answer right away. But it's definitely has shown like how important it is to have those connections all the way across campus. Some of it is just untested. We don't know. We don't know the right answer. The agencies don't really know the answers. Sometimes the disciplines don't know the right answers. So what do you do in those times? So you just try and be as pragmatic and rational as possible. And it's a challenge. But in the end, it's actually kind of a lot like a reference desk for data. Like people just coming at you with questions, and you're just there to help. And a lot of times it is, okay, hang on, we'll figure that out for you. So, or with you a lot of times. So there's that, but then there's also been quite a bit of rewards. So this is more fun to concentrate on. So we asked the question at the end of one of the workshop, what was most useful? Some feedback that we got back was all of it. I only wish there was more time. And documentation. I didn't do that for my PhD. Storage and backup. So that's good to hear. I'll say, and I don't know if you have campus-wide services for storage and backup, but we don't. Like it's pretty uneven across all the units, and we spend an inordinate amount of time sometimes talking about backup. And even that we don't have figured out in a very straightforward way. So when we talk about data needs and people think about big data and all this wonderful, fabulous things we're gonna do, and in the end we're just talking about backing up your computer. I mean, really, really basic things. So I've actually said many times that if the whole first year I had did nothing but run around screaming, back up your computers, and actually everybody on campus backed up their computers, I would have been like a hero. Like I could have died, like knowing I accomplished something. Unfortunately, that's not like a big enough goal to really justify my existence. So we've done more, but it's kind of silly. It is pretty silly. See, the last one here I think I had is on the slide. Using research data service for distribution of derived data sets is a good idea. I wasn't enthusiastic about setting up a website for the project. With links to the results, this provides an easier and more sustainable alternative. Well, thank God, because we have a lot of faculty and projects on campus that do stand up, a random website or some kind of random database, and then funding goes away, and then it's like, what am I supposed to do with this? Well, can you export the whole thing as a CSV and give it to us that way? Like, we can't maintain, really unique services for, the myriad of projects that we have on campus. So this is a really terrific direction for us to go, and I was thrilled to see that feedback. Yes.
So do you have a lot of people on campus using commercial storage services like Box?
Yeah, we do. We actually have a Box contract for our entire campus. And we actually just got Google Apps and also OneDrive. So people do definitely use that kind of thing. And even that, so actually, so we're building a data repository right now, and actually our developers working on Box integration so that people could be able to basically transfer us things via Box. And so we'll keep looking for that. But I even more esoteric things like they, put up an access database and here's this, and they don't know how to run the queries anymore, and those kind of things, or Oracle, right? Feel free to.
So that must help a bit with the backup conundrum.
Yes, it does. As long as they do it, and as long as they're syncing. So and even that, things never work quite right. So even one of the things that we emphasize about backup is like check it, like check to make sure that it's actually working. So in the end, so much of what we tell people really seems like common sense, but it didn't occur to people all the time. Or yeah, we have a lot of common sense about a lot of things. I always joke about how I don't have a will, and it's common sense. I should have a will, right? So I actually have this little service that I signed up for, and it sends me an email every month that says you should write a will. And at least it keeps it in my head, and it's common sense for me to do it, but I still don't because it's just something that hasn't been, it's not that pressing need that's happening right now. So, but yeah, come tomorrow too, because I know a whole other spiel about that.
Does Illinois have a policy for data backup?
Not specific. Sorry, what kind of policy specific?
So we actually have an institutional level policy in our operations manual about backing up data.
Yeah, no. So I tried to push a bit more policies for our campus, and I think our campus was fairly hesitant about having any more policies.
Reasonably so.
Yeah. So not that I have found anyway. And in fact, the only thing that we can find in terms of data policies, or that I've been able to find, is in our statutes. It just says original data is not in our state. It's like literally 4 words. That's everything that I have been able to find. Certainly, I don't know if they're policies per se, and maybe they are, but certainly our security office, has a lot of guidelines and recommendations of things you can and cannot use for different kinds of data. But in terms of document policies, I'm sure.
So where do you send researchers with legacy data? that's out of scope for you?
Yeah, so we're working on a list of vendors. So these are vendors that we have used within, the library. We think that they're really good, so we send them off in that direction. That's what we can do.
Third party.
Yeah, third party, basically, if it's important enough to you to go that route. Yeah, it's not the best, but it's just reality at this point. I mean, I was on the job for maybe a month, and someone's like, "Oh yeah, that entire building, the attic is just full of boxes of data." I'm like, fabulous. And I have never talked to that person again.
That's what you do.
What are you gonna do? Right? So, I mean, that's the, I mean, in the end, like, really, what are you gonna do? I mean, people with boxes of surveys where it's like human-centered research. Like, we're not on that IRB. We have no idea what's in there.
Sorry, you haven't been hearing me?
Yeah.
Should I start all over?
Sarah, maybe turn it down a
Too
bit
loud.
though, yeah.
I don't really know how this thing works. Can you hear me? Or maybe that's not.
That's too far.
Should I just start singing? And then you tell me when is it good? Better? Anything?
There you go.
Closer? Better? Can you hear me now? A little connectivity issue? Can you hear me?
Much
Yeah.
better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good. Let's see. Let's do this. Now you can hear my every little tiny mumble though. So where were we? We're legacy data. Yeah, legacy data. That's our answer to that. So that really brings back to the point of why it's really important to try and manage the data from the get-go, and also think about some amount of culling process. We can't keep all the data. I've done kind of back of the envelope calculations for our campus. Leaving our supercomputing center aside, and we have petabytes upon petabytes of data. We just can't reasonably store it all. And is it even in a format that's going to be, valid or useful? Like we could get a gigantic tape archive and we could stick it all in there, and some institutions have. I don't think the storing, as I said before, I don't think the storing is really going to be our problem. I think it's the actual management that's really the problem. So, let me see. Next one I had was services included several in-person consultations with concrete suggestions offered for troubleshooting data management and documentation challenges. So that was a good one. The research data service allowed us to host a large number of data files with the potential to be used in multiple publications permanently on a reliable server. And I'll actually talk about this specific example more tomorrow. And then finally, RDS was a key player in successful accomplishment of the SHARP data repository study. So this was a really interesting situation where somebody's funder came to them and said, hey, there was this massive multidisciplinary study with like thousands of human subject research actually for fitness and cognitive measures. And the agency came to them and said, hey, there's this new thing about data and everybody wants it to be available. So scope out what it would look like for either us as the agency to stand up a repository or for you guys to develop a repository. And so same thing, we really, in the end, encourage them to look for existing repositories and support existing repositories because sustainability of all of these resources just really up in the air. And you're just reinventing the wheel so many times. Super rewards. So I'm a biochemist by training, so I have my whole motivation for all of this is really just for people to manage their data and just work more efficiently. So as a graduate student, I worked long hours, I beat my head against the wall. That's what research is like. It is really, really taxing and time consuming. So my best rewards are when I actually hear about people really genuinely managing their data. And so these are from 2 graduate students who said, now if I open an old Excel file and I see it doesn't have a readme tab, I'm like, man. When someone emails me data without documentation, I've started replying, you accidentally forgot the readme. So these are great because these are also, like cultural changes within those groups, right? So that starts setting the expectation for documentation and really management of the data. So that's what gives me a lot of heart. So we probably might want to hear what I would do differently if I were to start all over again.
would actually not be with the Research Data Service as the director of the Research Data Service. That's a little bit funny. But it's such a generic word, or just a generic sounding name. So people do come at us actually with administrative data and FERPA data, and like there's no bound on what that really means, and so they come at us from a lot of different directions. And so I guess that's good for in terms of actually getting a lot of people to come to you. So when it's that vague, but I feel actually like it's a little too big. Maybe in 5 years, and we've actually had more time to develop things out further, it'll feel more appropriate. But right now, it feels a little too broad.
What would you name it instead?
I would probably call it the data archiving service, or data management service, data management archiving service. It's not like I've got some zinger that I think will really draw them in, but probably something just a little bit less opaque. I would actually hold off on starting a data repository, and this is fairly controversial, or maybe that's too strong of a word, but actually I was just talking with our dean about this a couple days ago, and I can certainly talk with any of you guys about this more, but in some ways it feels like we're 3 years too late and we're 3 years too early. 3 years too late in terms of there are a lot of kind of commercial or generic platforms out there like Figshare or whatever. There's new ones coming online already. But then when we go and we try and do it ourselves, it takes a ton of time and a ton of thought. But we're also trying to implement it in a way that we are really thinking about stewardship. We are really thinking about linking objects, articles to data, to maybe to code, to data that lives someplace else. And so we're using DataSite, and the DataSite schema just isn't quite robust enough for that right now. And so we're really struggling with actually implementing it in a way that we know is going to be thoughtful and really have a lot of value. So in that way, it feels like we're 3 years too early. Like people just haven't figured that out yet. I don't think it's a bad exercise, but one thing is, I don't know if you've gotten this yet so far, is if you think that there might not be a need for a research data service at all, that's definitely not true. Like we're working our butts off. So there's a lot of things that we could do, and I sometimes wonder if this is the best place for our energy right now anyway. I would have insisted on dedicated communications support. Our library is not good about this as a whole. We don't have a communications unit. It's frustrating because our library does so many really amazing, wonderful things that people have no idea that we do. We're also way overworked, so I guess that's good in a way, because if everybody came to us with knowing everything we did, then we probably couldn't keep up with it. But that can be a bit frustrating, and so sometimes we also don't do it nearly as professionally as I would like to be able to do it either. Probably ask more why questions as follow-ups. I actually do this a lot already, probably annoyingly so, but really questioning what our motivations are, I think, a lot of times. And then I would say no even more than I already have, and I have said no quite a bit to things, but maybe some collaborations that really just aren't, maybe the best fit, or some projects that, or committees. I should have said no to more committees. So those are some things. What would I do the same though? I would constantly question the benefits. I think all the time about, what are we trying to do, and who is it really benefiting? Like, is it benefiting the discipline? Is it benefiting that research group? Is it benefiting us as a library? Who's this really for? And in 5 or 10 years, what's really the value that's going to be? Continue to be pragmatic. So I'm external to the library. I'm not a librarian, and I found the library to be this wonderfully idealistic place. But it's really idealistic, and I'm a very pragmatic person. It turns out if you were to stick me in a library bin, I would be a records and information management person. I'm like, nope, out it goes. Nope, out this. I just cut the cord. That's okay. There's plenty of other people to balance that tendency in the library. I've got all my idealists, and I'm like, so. And continue to build rapport. I think in the end, relationships are really important here. I think that's also what sustains us as humans as part of our jobs. I'm very focused externally, so I think about engaging with people external to our library all of the time. And there's actually plenty of in-reach that needs to happen too, to talk to people about what is the value of the research data service to your own work as a librarian. But I still spend most of my time thinking outside, and that'll come up in a couple slides too. And I'd also read the government documents really critically. The OSTP memo, which is what started this whole thing, is really waffly on its own, and that's absolutely reflected in the implementation plans that have come from the different funding agencies. So they clearly don't know. They clearly don't know what to do. And so trying to be a bit pragmatic and a little bit, middle of the road is really where I'm going with a lot of things. And I'll continue to read them critically. That's not to say that things aren't moving, but they're not going to move quickly and they're not going to move cleanly. That's just how it's going to go.
So you talked about who is this for?
Mhm.
Thinking about that. Are you thinking about it on a per project basis? Or do you try to think about, bigger picture, who is this for? Is this a service to help the faculty? Is this really to position us for compliance with federal agency guidelines? I'm sure it's multifaceted, but what are the ones that really drive your service?
So it really drives us right now is really on the individual person, the really individual faculty and the project basis, because unless it's of immediate benefit to them, they're not going to come to us and they're not going to actually want to engage in anything. So that's kind of the first sphere of it. So until we can build that rapport and that relationship and that we are a service that literally helps people, we're not going to get to those broader things very well. So that's the first thing is like we need to be helpful to people. And then from there we can build, a lot of examples and really demonstrate the value as a whole. It's like, here you put this data set in here and you didn't think that anybody gave a hoot about it, but it's been downloaded 10,000 times or 1,000 times, it doesn't matter. It's like, look, more valuable than you thought it was, isn't it? Let's talk about increasing, better metadata for that then. Let's talk about better documentation. So once you can demonstrate to people that, it really does have this value, then I think it's gonna have a lot better legs than right now. It's like, well, somebody might care. That's not enough. That's not enough to convince anybody right now. And especially, kind of back to even just the data management part is, I know from faculty, and I will talk about this tomorrow too, is like, they don't manage the data well, and they have absolute continuity problems as their graduate students or postdocs cycle on and off projects, and they know that they could do better, and they would like to, it's just like how, and it's not as easy as it seems like it should be. Just manage your data. Conform to a file naming schema. It's not quite that easy. Did I answer your question? Okay, good. So there are some, talking about user-presented challenges and benefits. So there are some, challenges internal to the library, and so a lot of this is about balance. So especially when we're engaging people, subject specialists or functional specialists like our preservation unit, where they have full-time jobs about something else, right? So how do you fit in data as another thing for them to actually try and fit into the workload? So that's an issue. Digital preservation, like how to do this in an automated way, on a larger scale, is going to definitely be a challenge for us. So data comes in a gazillion different formats, different structures. How to really do preservation of that, I think is going to be a challenge. It's kind of a collection management issue too. In the end, we're having a collection, a pretty rare collection of data, these digital files. So how are we going to manage that as a collection as a whole? And that comes back to this, kind of preservation review that I was talking about. And finally, just overflow. There's so much out there. There's so much going on. There's different organizations, and there's different services, and there's different, sometimes competing interests, but there's also just a lot of polarization even within the different disciplines about data sharing and data management as a whole. So just trying to keep up to date on everything that's going on is challenging. And so I think that's one of the values we bring as the research data services. It's our job to pay attention to it all the time. So if it isn't your full-time job, then you can come to us and be like, hey, my faculty member just forwarded this thing to me about Medley data. What should I think about that? To help them through that. But likewise, there's also been some internal library rewards. So I started making this slide and I was like, this is our reward. And I was like, oh, this would be make a lot more sense if I actually asked our library. So what has been the reward of having a research data service? So I, emailed a swath of people who have been engaged with us and asked them what they thought the value it has been for the research data service to the library itself. And it kind of broke down into these 4 different areas: innovation, learning, community, and service. And just to quote, I like quotes, I guess. For innovation, bringing the library closer into collaborative contact with NCSA, which is our supercomputing center, and the sciences. Learning, the ability to understand the nuances of the entire data spectrum allows me to talk to researchers intelligently about their research challenges and needs. It's a really good one there. I'm not a one-person solo band trying to identify data needs and create services on my own. And then finally, positive influence on our collection development activities, both traditional resources as well as the procurement of data resources. So I thought those were really fabulous, and actually they don't really do them justice, so I compiled them all, and I'm actually going to submit it to the eResearch community blog, because I also have one from Dean Wilkin, which is pretty great as well. So clearly, in ways that I didn't even think of off the top of my head anyway, there's been a lot of different benefits to actually having the research data service within the library. So what would it mean for you, I guess, Iowa as a campus, but also specifically the library? So there's definitely a lot of opportunity there in terms of gaining knowledge. So knowing more about the research life cycle, not just the data's life cycle, but how researchers really work and how also what their challenges and their scope is. But also gaining a whole bunch of knowledge about different data formats and use mechanisms. So this brings up the need to really have the connections, like with the different units on campus in terms of the IT unit and the IRB and sponsored projects, and there's a whole bunch of different ways that those connections really play into this. And so there's just a lot of opportunity then, an opportunity to serve faculty in a way that libraries haven't really necessarily been serving them before. In particular, I think the thing that generally makes the librarians most excited is it really is the opportunity to preserve and make accessible scholarly content that hasn't been accessible and preserved before. And so I think that's one of the major things there. So my final 2 slides, I'm just going to say, well, does research data need libraries? And I haven't seen anybody taking any pictures, but I am going to say, just in case anybody's been stealth about it, not to tweet the next slide. It's okay. I just don't want to take it out of context, because we're actually working with a computing facility on our campus right now, a very big computing facility that does wonderful and fabulous work. And as part of their program, they're trying to share data, and so they put some of their data online as part of their sharing service. And so what I have on the next slide is a splash page then for what that data looks like. So this is the splash page, and I kid you not, this is publicly available. The name of this data set is folders space old underscore Jacob comma space new Jacob old B. This is the name of the data set. So, and then this is the metadata that's associated with it. So they are fabulous, wonderful at being a supercomputing center. Like, they know how to do that left and right. These kinds of things just isn't their wheelhouse. It's not what they're good at. I show this to my group and we like cringe and cry, right? We want to help in these kinds of areas. And I also dare you to find this. Like, I dare you to Google this and find it. Like, you'll never be, you can barely find it on their website. It's like literally like, I don't know, 8 layers in or something like that. So this is a really great example where you take, a group that has fabulous expertise in what they do, and we have really great expertise in making this, much more robust and standardized and discoverable. And so we're actually working with them right now on getting them DOIs and, standardizing and cleaning up their metadata and also making it more complete. So yes, data does need libraries because we can do these kinds of things well. I really think that's part of our role there. Finally, just to acknowledge, we have really terrific buy-in from across our library, and we work a lot with our archives. Archives are fabulous. They have been, dealing with really tough challenges, as their discipline. They've been having to cull and read and, assess value for a really long time. So they've been terrific partners. Our context access management is our cataloging and metadata department. For some reason, they call it that. I guess they said it wasn't sexy enough to just call it cataloging. So it's called CAM. Working with our data services, our digital humanities, engineering, life sciences, physical sciences, all of those people, our state scientific surveys, and we absolutely work a lot with our preservation department as well. So really across the library, we really have tie-ins in a lot of different places. So which brings me to the actual people who are the most important part then. So I said there's 4 of us who are dedicated solely, but then there's this whole sphere of people that we interact with either daily, weekly, monthly, on different kinds of things. And this probably isn't still even everybody, but it is a whole swath of people at our library who really care and are committed. And they're a fabulous group to work with. I couldn't ask for a better environment. So that was my last slide. So do you have any? Yes.
I apologize, I came in a little bit late, but did you talk about how many people are in your group?
Yeah, so there's 4 of us. We have a developer, we have 2 data curators, and me are the core of the research data service. And then, like I said, we have a committee, an RDS committee that is comprised of everybody from all those disciplines, so including our archives. And then we just kind of rope people in from there on different, targeted projects. So.
And then do you in the library actually do storage of data?
So we actually contract our storage out with our supercomputing center.
Okay.
So we don't, we had been for many years, but it's kind of one of those things where the library doesn't do it as well as the supercomputing center does.
Exactly.
Like, we don't have the buying power, so it just
Okay.
makes sense to move it over.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned registering DOIs.
Mhm.
Can you talk more about that? It's like, at what point is an object DOI worthy, I guess?
Yeah, so there's a good example of where like maybe 3 years too early. There's a lot of kind of debate might be too strong of a word, but just kind of uncertainty about when is the appropriate time to register a DOI. What does permanence mean? How permanent does the resource have to be? Versioning issues, a lot of those kinds of things. So we actually on a continuum anyway of being like, no, it has to be something persistent that somebody's trying to promise to forever, to being something that there's a pretty big continuum anyway where I have some real doubts about the persistence tomorrow for some of the things that have been registered a DOI for. So we sit on the side of like for our supercomputing center, it's terabytes of data, it's probably not going to be available forever. But on the other hand, unless people can discover it and actually use it, we're never going to be able to make the argument that it should be available forever. So in those kind of cases, we really just ask that, you tell us what your commitment is. Like it'll be around for, or we're committing to storing it through the end of our project, which ends in 2018 or something like that. There is tombstoning. I mean, that's part of the DOI is persistent. There's actually not really anything anywhere that says the data behind it has to be persistent. So this is uncomfortable, right? It is an uncomfortable thing, but it's just the nature of it right now. And so trying to meet needs, but also think at least get some kind of commitment out of it instead of just here it is, knock yourself out. I don't know if that answered your question at all, but I can talk at length about it. I don't know if we're going to lunch or anything, but I can yabber a long time about DOIs. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So discoverability. So I have this vision that this information, this metadata, whatever is going to be in our online catalog or in our IROs, that it is discoverable. What are you doing at Illinois?
Yeah, so we're building a dedicated repository, and then we do register with data sites, so all the metadata does get pushed back to the main data site registry, so it gets pushed back. So that helps for discovery. But then our institutional repository, they already have optimized it for being able to be crawled by Google. So in fact, I think our repository manager said something like 60 to 70% of hits into the repository come straight from Google. So that's one thing too. Is another thing libraries know about is appropriate indexing, so things can be found and discovered.
So on the flip side of discovery, you talked about IRB compliance kinds of issues.
Yeah.
What is your strategy for dealing with that kind of data? Because I mean, you can't make it discoverable, but
Right.
that doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be managed in some way.
Yeah, so we don't have that figured out entirely right now. So our first kind of thing is, well, for the discoverable data, we need that kind of system to begin with. But there's a couple different mechanisms that we could try and go forward on that. One, there are great repositories, ICPSR already is an example for where they do have secure data enclaves. So if there's a better place for the data, we're not going to be all territorial and be like, no, Illinois has to take on its own data archive or data enclave. But beyond that, there's a good chance that even ICPSR wouldn't take it all. So there are a couple different things that I think we can try and do. There's a Dataverse does this thing called like a guest book, and so the metadata is discoverable, but then you have to get permissions actually from the PI in order to really see the data. That's one example. We know that it's going to be an issue in a direction that we'll have to go, but we haven't even started trying to implement anything as of yet. Also, one thing that we're, that we are noticing is that, people have come to us and like, hey, PLOS wants me to make this data available, and I don't know if I can. And I go, what does your consent form say? And it says, data will only be shared in aggregate. That's what the consent form says. So I fall really hard on the line of like, whatever you promised your participants is what you have to do. I don't care what PLOS says. So, but that being said, let's talk about your next project, because actually ICPSR has some really great guidance on how to write consent forms so that you could be able to share data later. Still being cognizant though of the mosaic effect and the possibility of data sets being recombined. As researchers, we have had a history of not always treating our subject participants, as carefully as we should have. So I'd much rather fight the fight of like, no, I don't think we should share this data, than fight the fight of finding out somebody got identified that shouldn't have been. So it's not always a popular opinion either, but we don't have to move so fast that we put people in jeopardy. And certainly some research is very sensitive, and I know we've had researchers come to some of our workshops being really, really concerned. They work with minors with sensitive topics, and like it's just off the table then. Like they can barely get participants to participate at all, let alone with being told that their data's out there. Yeah. Good questions. Anything else?
For your services, do you charge?
Not yet. So one thing that I didn't actually mention at all is, so in working with our supercomputing center, we're standing up basically active storage. So it's, but on larger scale, so more than you would be able to get per box. Like I think per box we can get people up to 1 terabyte, although it's still, web enabled, so it's not necessarily great for that. So it's storage that people can rent like per terabyte per month, so it's fairly large blocks of storage for people. That is cost recovery, so we can't give that away for free. Technically speaking, like if somewhere in our the RDS planning document or whatever the OVCR approved is something like anything beyond 5 hours, we would do cost recovery for our time. There's a whole another, government costing issue, and there's some other, we don't even have a really good sense of like, is 5 hours appropriate? What can we do in 5 hours? Is 5 hours us figuring out what our job is? Well, that's really not fair to start charging people. So I think it'd be a couple of years before we actually started charging anybody for that. So,
You notice that some disciplines are easier to work with or harder to work with, and if so, which ones?
I find people are, some people are.
You mentioned like, if there are some disciplines, like maybe you're not getting much humanities data yet because they don't see the need for it, or you're not, just in broader ways where people.
Honestly, no. I feel like we've had, really pockets of people from all over campus have really picked up on it. So, in terms of difficulty, I do think in terms of human subject, I think, those are areas where it's just a lot trickier. Business data can be quite tricky just because a lot of times that is third party, and so, there's a whole other issues around there. I was on the job for maybe a week, and our export control officer found me because, really concerns about anything that is, military or, biowarfare or anything like that related. So I think, most of the difficulties come around where it's not this nice, clean, here's a CSV file about lollipops or, or bacteria or something like that. It's the trickier stuff. It's the trickier stuff that takes up the majority of the time. So, yeah.
I'm interested in your reporting structure upwards and also funding, where funding comes from.
Yeah, sure. So reporting wise, so we are within the library, so we report through the library up to the dean, well, at least like I do. The dean of the libraries, yes. But then, I still view actually, so our funding came from our OVCR and our provost. So we have administrative funding that was transferred to the library. So I still view our Vice Chancellor of Research as kind of like our funding agency. And so it's a good idea and plus he's a scientist, so it's really good to get his feedback. I'm like, this is where we're going, this is what we think is pragmatic. And they have this overarching understanding too of, what the campus can really do. Obviously huge concerns about budgets and cuts and things like that. So that's where our money came from, and that's for our reporting structure. So it's like our dean, the dotted line to our OVC doctors.
Curious if other departments that you work with have their own, especially ones that have been generating data for a long time, have their own little mini data services unit, and if you work with them, and how how does that work, and how has that been working?
Yeah, so I know there are some IT departments who already do like data management plan consultation. So in that sense, there has been some of that already. Again, we don't feel the need to be territorial. There's 4 of us in a massive campus. So if there's a unit that already has really great services, terrific. And it definitely has happened that we've, somebody will come to us with a fairly technical IT question, like about secure data transfer or something, and we route them to their IT person. And so we'll participate in different IT activities, like we have an IT pro forum twice a year, and so we are, go there and present actually. So one of the data curators will be presenting there this week while I'm gone. And, so you form the network. So the only thing is when you have conflicting advice between two people. So I saw, where did I see this? Some report that people probably didn't think I was going to read, kind of a thing. Something about websites and do you need more storage for your data on our, self-hosting web service. And there's an example where I'd like to talk to them more about, we really would rather not people try and stand up their own individual websites and do this. I understand like our services are fairly generic, they're not going to meet everybody's needs, But if you're really just linking to data on a website and something underneath, you should just put that in the repository from the get-go and just link to that instead of having to do this massive transfer after the fact. But so far, I think we've been doing a pretty good job of building these relationships and being able to talk to people. We have a really fabulous, it's kind of a funny situation. She's like a professional practicum student. She just got her MLS from GISLIS at the university, but she actually works full-time as part of our tech services, our campus-wide IT unit. And she's been doing this this practicum with us for this semester and helping us do user testing actually on our repository. And she's been a fabulous conduit and what's been going on, and so those kinds of things. We also have an RDS partnerships committee, which has people from all of those different units being representatives, and so I try and get them together quarterly, although I sometimes fail to with my scheduling abilities to try and keep everybody on the same page and connected and thinking strategically. Feel free to challenge anything too that I've said. So I did a defense. I'm used to being going, oh, that's BS. So, I mean, there's a lot that is fairly, uneven and questionable and not quite sure. And I think of it as being highly experimental, actually. This is an experiment, and so we're going to figure out how to do it. And some things are going to be failures. Some things are going to be, kind of a spur of the moment, yeah, let's do that, and it turns out to be a really fabulous idea, so that's happened too.
Can you forecast 3 years into the future? You mentioned that in some ways you don't feel like we're there yet.
Yeah. So I think in 3 years in the future, can I go 10 years?
Sure.
We'll do that instead. So I think, in terms of experimental anyway, I think what's going to happen is, okay, so there's a push for more data, there's a push for more openness and transparency. So based on what I know of the disciplines that I've been part of and talking with other people on campus, there's a bit of fetishizing about data right now, like it's the end all and be all of everything. And that's not quite right. Like data, it doesn't have the same weight in every discipline the way that it does for everybody. So, but regardless, there's this push. Okay, we're gonna make it all available. And there's resources that are accumulating tons and tons of data. So I think at the end of 10 years, what we're going to have done is this experiment is we're going to figure out what's actually useful. So we're going to be able to go back and go, yeah, you're right. Your bacterial, gene trace, not necessarily. This agricultural data from all of your tractor sensor stuff, really useful. And so we'll be able to go back and we'll look. And so this is a gigantic experiment where we're just going to collect everything, and in the end, we'll be able to say this was useful, this was not. Now, that being said, there's judgment calls in that, and just because it wasn't useful in that 10 years doesn't mean, in the next 10 years it would have been useful, and that's definitely a risk. That's a risk. That's, we don't know. But that's actually one of the things, too, that's really great about libraries and subject specialists and collection development is, there's that critical assessment of collections that come in is like, this doesn't have a whole lot of use right now, but I know that this is special and unique, and it's going to be important to my discipline and my department, so it's actually a really good transferable way that I think libraries will also be able to feed into that mechanism of, it was never used, but you know what, this is special. We should keep it. So I actually think it'll take years. So 3 years, 3 years, I'll probably come back and say a lot of the same things. I don't know, but that's where I see us in 10 years.
Do you see your position in you, like that 10 years learning and experimenting?
Yeah, I also think we're gonna have to have. So nothing. I mean, because we're talking about an ecosystem too, where there's articles over here, and there's some data here, and there's some data there, and there's, it is an ecosystem of objects that are going to live in different places. Period. Like I don't think we're ever going to have the master consolidated resource where everything all lives in one place. There's just too many players, publishers, universities, the agencies. So I think what's going to be really important then is really robust linking of things in between, and that's really where I think. Certainly we're trying to be strategic about that. I know other people are trying to be strategic about that, but it's not quite there, definitely not automated, and a lot of things have to evolve in terms of journal practices, research practices, are being nimble, a lot of that. Mm-hmm. Sure.
So you talked about these things being Google accessible. Do you consider them part of the library collection? Is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So right now our institutional repository isn't part of our library catalog, and apparently, and I apologize for not knowing this or not being deep enough into this, but I guess in our library and other libraries, there's a question about is our catalog the things we've bought, or is it a catalog of everything people use? And I think that hasn't been completely decided right now. And of course, you are trying to like crosswalk disparate metadata across into your library catalog.
So do you have a discovery system or a library catalog?
Sorry, that I don't even know the appropriate answer to. I'll just say my ignorance right there.
I'm just curious. I mean, we have a discovery system,
I'm
so
sure
it's
they
not
do.
just, what's that?
I'm sure they do.
I'm sure they do. So,
Yeah.
but it's not discoverable in there, even that.
Oh, well, okay, so I can back up and say, so we have a homegrown, like we had used Primo for a while, so I think this is where we're going. So we have a homegrown system that Bill Michaud, if anybody knows Bill at the Granger Engineering Library, and a whole bunch of other terrific people at the library have worked on. And it's called Easy Search, and actually does go through and crawls a whole bunch of different contents that we have. And datasets is actually one of them. So he's already ahead of the game on that, like, for that.
Yes,
So,
that's what I was.
sorry,
thinking.
yeah.
So, yeah, that makes sense.
I get nervous about, like, I'm not sure what the technical, is that technically the right thing that I'm thinking of? Okay. I think you had another question?
Yeah, so when you were talking about the future, and like talking about, as an example, tractor data, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, so is there some sort of like technology transfer component that sort of drives research on campus that then reflects on you, that you have to accommodate something? I guess that's a vague question. I guess I'm thinking, so somebody has data on tractors that leads to a patent.
Oh,
perhaps,
right, yes.
and something like, so there's a whole intellectual property thing involved.
Yeah, that's a good, so are you asking if we would maybe dark archive some things that are, have IP restrictions around them?
Well, I guess I was more just thinking, do those people demand your services more or create more noise on campus for data?
Create more noise on campus, that's a really
Data
great way to
production.
think of some of the things.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe maybe this will answer your question. If it doesn't, then we'll try again. So managing the data is like agnostic of the sensitivities and IP and all of that. All of that is agnostic to the fact that whether or not you can share it ultimately. So there's really just about need to actually literally share your data, whether or not it never ever leaves your lab or your research group. So in that terms, I think our services are really cross-cutting across all parts of the campus then. Certainly when it comes to the point about actually making it accessible or storing it long-term or archiving, we're not really there yet in terms of like what are we gonna try and dark archive. In general, I'm really nervous about the library becoming a dark archive. It's not what we do as a library. Unless I know for sure either too that it was like legitimately managed and it's not just like, here's my desktop, keep it, that kind of thing.
So that may be an instance where you would turn somebody down and say,
Yeah.
we don't really do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Solve this yourself.
Yeah, this is on you.
Yeah.
So it's such a sad reply to people, but we can't do everything. And certainly right now, I mean, a year and a half in, and that's so far out of scope that I'm just trying to still on the backups.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's good. It's forward thinking. Like definitely that'll be in terms of 3 years. That's probably he answered that question better than I did.
You talked about there being a big focus on data right now.
Mm-hmm.
And you also talked early on about the consultative process and how when you sit down with a faculty member or grad student, they really want to talk about the process of their research.
Mm-hmm.
And there are going to be multiple different things that are coming up in that. Part of that will be data related, part of it will be analysis related.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see, do you think that segmenting off data as something is the right way to
No.
conduct things?
I really don't. I think I've thought about this recently in terms of, so maybe 5-7 years or so, like methods were a really big thing, and people are like, oh, we have to have much better methods, and there's going to be methods journals, and we're going to do all this stuff about methods, and it's going to help transparency in science, and didn't quite catch on the way that people really thought it would. And so then I thought about, well, why has data gotten this like drive behind it? And I think that's because it transfers really well out to, third party or commercial. So like, it's also like AT&T also has problem with data where AT&T didn't have problems with methods. So I think it cuts across, or maybe they do, but it didn't come up, right? So I think it cuts across so that it's popping up in the media in so many different ways that there's like this big push towards it. I also think there's more, like for example, our supercomputing center is really interested in data and wants everybody to have data because they want to be doing supercomputing things on it, where that wasn't going to happen with methods or things like that. So I think that's why there's been so much emphasis on data, is because it just really speaks to people in a lot of different ways. But we're also in this, I really hate like how, I'm not the most eloquent speaker perhaps as you realize, but how buckety data has gotten in terms of like, here's the data bucket and we put everything in it. That means samples, that means code, that means this, that means methods, it means everything. And so it's such a weird thing to present to people as your data is everything, or you care about everything, but then they're like, no, it's this thing over here that I was taught in my discipline is data. So I think that's really confusing to people right now, or at least to some people. And the agencies are waffly about that. A lot of people are waffly about what data even really means. But in terms of like really moving research forward, no, it's not just going to be about data. It's going to be about the whole life cycle in terms of doing all of it in ways that are a bit more thoughtful. And I actually think this has a lot to do with just the fact, kind of back to the overflow idea, is that there's so much everything right now that people just don't even have time to stop and think about any part of it. So.